speaker tonight, Seyyed Nasr, currently University Professor of Islamic Studies at the George Washington University, Washington, D.C. is one of the most important and foremost scholars of Islamic religious and comparative studies in the world today. Born in 1933, Professor Nasr began his illustrious teaching career in 1955 when he was still a young and promising doctoral student at Harvard University. Over the years, he has taught and trained an innumerable number of students who have come from different parts of the world, and many of whom have become important and prominent scholars in their fields of study. He has trained different generations of students over the years since 1958, when he was a professor at Tehran University, and then in America since the Iranian Revolution in 1979, specifically at Temple University in Philadelphia from 1979 to 1984, and at the George Washington University since 1984 to the present day. The range of subjects and areas of study which Professor Nasr has involved and engaged himself with in his academic career and intellectual life are immense, as demonstrated by his numerous writings, lectures, and speeches. Professor Nasr speaks and writes with great authority on a wide variety of subjects, ranging from philosophy to religion and spirituality, to music and art and architecture, to science and literature, to civilizational dialogues and the natural environment. Please welcome Dr. Seyyed Nasr.
First of all, I want to thank the authorities of the University of Wisconsin and the Niagara Foundation and whoever else has been responsible for this conference and for bringing me here to the Midwest. After many years, I had lectured at the University of Wisconsin for God knows how many decades, and I'm very glad to be back. Originally, it was proposed that I should speak on Islam and democracy. I refused to do that. Too many lectures given on Islam and democracy, and gradually it's like an old record that grinds down, and I thought it was better to get to more profound issues which underlie the question of Islam and democracy, and that is to speak about Islam, individual, and society. As you know, one of the very important polarizations that took place in Western thought, which dominated much of the political philosophy and also the actual political life of the West since the 18th century, was this dichotomy between society and the individual. There are certain philosophies which consider society to be primal and the individual to have only meaning within the context of society, and others which emphasize the individualism, and they went all the way the spectrum from the most severe forms of Marxism to the most individualistic forms of liberalism and everything in between. Now, it's usually within the context of this dichotomy that the Islamic question is approached, included by many Orientalists and Islamicists, and this is really unfortunate because the Islamic perspective on the subject of the relation between the individual and society is very different. There is no polarity. There is no tension. I remember when I was a young student at MIT and Harvard, and studying with leading professors on this subject, there were those who were avidly defending the importance of society, and one felt as if that meant the death of the individual. I remember the text of Carl Gustav Jung, whom I do not like at all, but on the subject there was something very interesting. He said, when I think that I have to surrender myself to society, it's like being put in a grave. I feel that if I had died. And so the individuation of the individual was for him the saving, liberating grace. But at the other end of it, an individualism which would destroy the fabric of society, and which in fact would not go on in an unbridled fashion, was also seen by many to be an obvious fact, and debates were carried back and forth. And it was by the grace of God, by my return to my own tradition, that I was able to transcend this football game that was being played back and forth, if I can say so, between the two sides. And I was able to, by reading the classical text and by going beyond what certain people had said, although not all, there are some Orientalists, especially the late Sir Hamilton Gibb was one of the exceptional Western Orientalists, in fact, who realized that the Islamic way of looking at the individual and society was not based on a polarization between the two, but was quite something else. Anyway, I was able to come back to a humble understanding of what the Islamic view is on these two subjects and how they relate to each other. Of course, this is key for the understanding of social life, of political life, economic life, the whole external aspect of Islam and Islamic civilization is a very, very key and crucial matter. And in a lecture of an hour, I cannot get to every aspect of it. But I want to emphasize certain salient and very important features. Let me start with law. Law. As you know, all this audience consists of either Muslim scholars or scholars of Islam. I don't think anyone who has no knowledge whatsoever anything Islamic is here. So I presume a certain amount of basic knowledge, not too much, but a certain amount of it. But think of law. Of course, whenever we think of the word law in English or in Latin lex, we think of course, society. But we also think of the law that governs the individual. And the two, although in our mind are not always related, in reality they are related. If driving fast is the law that protects society, it's the law that also governs over my behavior when I'm sitting behind the wheel of a car and getting the secret cameras that make money for Washington, D.C. by penalizing us left and right with tickets that are more than the income of somebody in Bengal for 1 month. But you know what I'm talking about. The law of society and law which governs the individual, of course, are interrelated. But Islam looks upon this in a somewhat different way. First of all, what is the word for law in Islam? There are in fact two different words which became intertwined, although they began from very different origins. One is the Arabic word al-Sharia, which we translate as divine law. From the root shara'a, that is the road, avenue, path, and al-Sharia or asha, which could be that form, means divine law, and ultimately the only law that is binding upon a Muslim as a Muslim, that's also a very problematic question, because some laws in Islamic society, even from modern times, were not Sharia laws, and what status they had is another question that was discussed by legal authorities in the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. I'll just say one second by very soon. The second word is the word qanun. The word qanun in Arabic comes from the Greek word kanon, from which is related to the English word canon. And the word canon and qanun, canon law in the Catholic Church, and qanun have the same etymological roots, but with opposite meanings, paradoxically. Because in Christianity, canon law means the law of religion, or the church, whereas qanun in Islam means non-Sharia law. Non-Sharia law, but nevertheless something which exists. And great Ottoman Sultan was called Qanuni, Sulaiman Magnificent. It was a great title. It took pride in it. It didn't say, oh, this is against the Sharia, against Islam. Qanun itself was totally integrated into the Islamic perspective, and the ulama themselves accepted the fact, this is a very important point, that where there is no clear injunction of the Sharia, which in principle should encompass the whole of life, but in practice does not cover everything, as something which leaves out of its purview, then the qanun that is there and accepted by society should be accepted from the point of the Sharia. This was a mouthful I just said, but let me give you an example of it. The Sharia has nothing to say about stopping at the red light. In none of the classical books of Sharia, there is a chapter on stopping at a red light. But red light is part of the qanun, law of the society in which we live. The society in which we live, in a non-Islamic society, if the law does not then one must follow it as part of one's Sharia duty. So to stop at the red light is indirectly an Islamic duty. Of course, most Muslims don't listen to this and have not done so for the last 1300 years. It's very interesting. From the beginning of Islam, people who would go willingly pay their zakat, but it was considered to be very unmanly to be taxed according to the Qanun without being whipped a few times. Nobody would pay. You realize some of these nice Americans put their money on islands off the shores and you and I pay the taxes here. There were a lot of people that are tax evaders, and the attitude towards Qanun was very, very different. But according to Islamic law, what I said to you is the view of most of the jurists, Sunni and Shiite alike. So you had in the traditional Islamic world an idea of law, which the heart of which came from God, divine law. But also God had given us intelligence, the view of the society, of course, all the other sources of Islamic law, ijma', qiyas, and so on, we're not going to that, and laws which, in fact, the Quran does not speak about, but which are necessary in human society, and which should be done in harmony or followed in harmony with the Sharia, what the Quran says. And the fact that the Sharia was always a living reality from the very, very beginning, and it was not a dead tree, as many people have made it. It was a living tree. It grew new branches. But it was always in interaction with Qanun, with the situations that came up, and for which the governments, even before modern times, which were sultanates or monarchies or caliphates, whatever they were, had to make laws. There's a very interesting instance of that. When the Arab armies reached Khorasan, they discovered in Khorasan a wonderful Persian melon, a long one like this, which is so delicate it doesn't come to the United States. You can find it in London, it gets as far as London. One of the great fruits of the world, incredible fruit that grows in Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Greater Khorasan. And the Arab ruler was astounded by this incredible fruit. And it was expensive at that time, and so he wanted to put taxes on it. He wanted to collect taxes on it. And so there was no guidance what to do. He wrote to the caliph. He wrote to the caliph that there's this wonderful fruit here, and we don't know what to do with the taxation. There's nothing in Islamic law, Islamic law, Sharia had not been codified as Sharia then, but there was the example of the Prophet in Medina and the early Islamic community already had an uncodified Sharia by which the judges, in fact, judged people at court in the 1st century of the Hijrah. We know that. So he rushed to the caliph, what do we do? And he said that the story goes that was during the Caliphate of Omar when the Arabs conquered Persia, whether it was that or somewhat later. Anyway, the caliph looked at all the precedents, didn't find any. And he said there's no precedents in the practice of the Prophet, nothing in prophetic hadith. Collect the taxes as it was done before Islam came to Khorasan. And this itself will be the law of the land, the Islamic law, in the sense of Qanun complementing the Sharia. Now, I've made all this introduction for this point. It's not a lecture on Islamic law. I'm not a specialist in Islamic law, but I made all this introduction for this point that I want to get to. As Muslims have always seen it, the law pertains to a unit which itself is a sacred unit. That is, Islamic law and the Qanun, which all became on the outside, was integrated with the Sharia, was seen by Muslims as pertaining to a recipient who had a sacred nature. This is very, very sacred. My mother keeps a sacred nature, I will tell you. It was either the individual, created by God, Khalifatullah fil ard, and with immortal soul, here on a journey to eternity, all of the conditions which are central to the understanding of the Islamic message. Or the community, which was viewed, of course, not as an aggregate of individuals, but as the Ummah. It's extremely significant to understand the Ummah. I know everybody uses it, even the word ummatic has entered into English. My late friend Ibrahim Ismail al-Farouqi was massacred, killed in Philadelphia a few years back in a great tragedy for the Islamic world. He always used the word ummatic. That was his favorite word. So Ismail would stop bringing these Arabic words into English, but I'm myself very conservative in coining words. I don't know that I'm coining one word in the Persian language, the word for tradition, sunnat, which is caught on, and I use every other day in all the papers, but I usually try to avoid that. But he wanted to use that word. So all know the word ummah, ummatic, where he talks about it. The Islamic world at its present time in history always talks about the ummah, but does nothing about the ummah. This is a very strange period of our history, but the idea is extremely central and important. The idea was that the society is not simply the sum of individuals. The forest is not simply the sum of the trees. And here's where Islam went against this idea of extreme individualism, in which society was nothing but the sum of individuals, and what was important was the freedom of the individual, rights of the individual, property of the individual, and so on and so on. Because the Ummah was created by God, and Islamic thought has always looked upon all societies as Ummahs, and has analyzed social aggregates, humanities, various collectivities, human collectivities, as the Ummahs of various prophets. And especially since he dealt most of all with the Abrahamic world, he always talked in Arabic and Persian and Turkish, other Islamic languages, about the Ummah Muhammadiyya, Ummah Isawiyya, Ummah Musawiyya, and all the tribes of Israel as Ummah Nuhiyya, Ibrahimiyya. This is very famous in Arabic. Many words. And even this was extended when Islam went to India and China, beyond the boundaries of the Abrahamic world, or to Persian, which was the world of Zoroastrian and Manichaean religions. The idea that communities are defined by the laws given to them by God, not by ethnicity, not by race, not by geography, these are all secondary and irrelevant, but by their attachment to a particular form of divine law or revelation. That itself changed the whole status of racism in Islam, of race and ethnicity. It was totally secondary. Totally secondary. During the Ottoman period, for example, the Christians who were living in Turkey were just as Turkish as the Muslim Turks, but were seen as being the Ummah of Sayyid Isa. And that's why they have their own laws in certain matters. They have their own laws in certain matters. Now, this idea of a sacred community, and I will not talk about comparative religion, other communities, let's stick to Islamic. I can't cover everything one night, but the point is important to know. This view of society as Ummah, therefore, connected the law of God and the law of society in such a way that neither one would destroy the other or smother the other. The individual had to respect the law of the Ummah, but the Ummah also had to respect the law of the individual. This whole battle that we see, as I said, in 19th century European thought, European philosophy, political philosophy, especially between English and French and German, these three countries, thinkers, very important thinkers. Even going back to Hobbes and Locke and more classical English thinkers, and which came to the Nicene debates between Hamilton and Jefferson and all of these things. This was totally absent in the Islamic world. We didn't think in these categories. That is because the relation between the individual and society was seen in terms of divine law built by God for both individual and society. Let me give you a concrete example. During the month of Ramadan, according to Islamic law, an individual, even if sick and permitted by Islamic law not to fast, should not be pretentious and show off in public that he's eating or she's eating. That it should not break the norm for the community. The community, on the other hand, has no right to impose fasting upon the individual if the laws for the individual, because he's sick, tell him that he does not need to fast. This is a very, very important dynamic. I'm not saying it always worked. In Islamic history, some governments came to military government and tried to pressure and force things upon individuals, and all kinds of things happened. Many individuals did not listen to what the rights of society, but there was this reciprocity of human responsibility, human rights. And human rights, independent of the rights of society, were considered to be meaningless. And in fact, if you look upon it like this, you have to review completely the whole discussion of rights and responsibilities in the Islamic context. In the Islamic context, we have three responsibilities: to God, to ourselves, to the other. And the other includes not only society, human society, but all of God's creation, which the Quran calls ummas, the species of ants, or spiders, or elephants, are ummas for God. It's very, very interesting. They're seen as sacred societies. The word ummah is not only for human beings. In the Quran, it's mentioned several times, several surahs. So you had this relationship between man or woman, man or insan, man and woman. I don't mean rajul, I don't mean male, of course, I mean human being. Had responsibility towards God, responsibility towards himself, responsibility towards the other. Let's put aside the world of nature for the moment and just consider the social other for the moment. And from these responsibilities grew rights. In Islam, responsibility always comes before rights. I've written somewhere, in fact more than once I've said this, look at the word responsible, its analysis. It means there's something out there to which you respond. There has to be, first of all, something to which we are responsible. The rest, the prefix re in Latin implies, like the word return, something that goes back to something else. And from the Islamic point of view, we and God are not equal. God has created us, owe our existence to Him, and it's He who calls upon us. And our very existence is an answer to His call. And therefore, being comes from God, responsibility comes from us. We have absolutely no rights of our own independent of God, because we don't have any power of our own being independent of God. This Western idea of human rights in a purely secularist fashion means nothing in the Islamic context. There might be, in the 22nd century, so many Muslims become secularized, like Christians who become secularized who talk in these terms. I'm not talking about the future. Even today in the Islamic world, the number of people who talk about, who even understand human rights independent of God's rights and responsibility we have towards God are very few. They might come on CNN every night and get paid and become Harvard professors. That's irrelevant, totally irrelevant. You know what I'm talking about. Anyone today in the Islamic world who curses at Islam gets immediately a green card and become a Harvard professor who was in Chicago in 24 hours. I'm being a bit facetious and angry at this cynicism that is going on amidst us. But in a serious fashion, the human being, by virtue of who he or she is, owes his or her existence to God. And our rights are given to us by God, by virtue of fulfilling our responsibilities defined by God through the revelation of His laws. How do we know what responsibility I have. According to Islam, God has let us know through the Prophet and through the revelation, through the Quran and Hadith and so on and so on. I will not get into. So, when we talk about individual society, first of all of the law, we must remember that Islamic law complements human existence on the individual level and in the social aggregate level. Each has its own duties, its own rights. Man cannot break the laws of society. Society cannot be aggressive against the rights of the individual as given by God. And from this came a remarkable equilibrium, which classical Islamic thought prevented what happened in the West from the 19th century onward. There's a kind of totalitarianism which based itself on the primacy of society and excessive liberalism, which led, in fact, to dissolution and even revolution in a certain sense. And the profound reason that Islam did not produce is Karl Marx and Lenin's and theoreticians at the Nazi Party, this totalitarian view of looking at society as the ultimate reality, resulting in the West in an extremely leftist form, in communism, extremely rightist form, in Nazism was not only on the left. The fact that this phenomenon never occurred in Islam, of course, you should ask why. Why were neither Stalin nor Lenin nor Hitler born in an Islamic country? We've certainly had many bad dictators, many ruthless people who had a share of people as bad as them, but on a smaller scale. But theoretically, ideologically, because this dichotomy could not have come into existence in the traditional way that Islam looked upon the relationship between society and the individual. Now, let me come to the second one, the question of ethics. So far, spoken about law. Ethics. Again, in Islam, ethics involves the individual. Ethics involves society at large. Society cannot act as one being ethically. It's actually judged ethical according to norms which are set in that society. Society is not a single conscious person. There's a big debate that goes on in Islam, which also exists in Judaism, whether a collectivity as a whole is responsible for ethical action or not. And whether God punishes a collectivity as a whole if most of its members or some of its members do evil. This is a very important religious and ethical debate which you find also in Christianity, but especially in Judaism and in Islam, where the question of the sin of the forefathers, which is mentioned in the Old Testament, was so important. You're going to have to pay for your father's sin. Why am I responsible? These are the deep theological issues. Of course, I cannot get into them again in depth, but I can say a word about them. You can't even say one word which is deep. You don't have to go to a long explanation of everything. But let me just mention this. God judges us as individuals. We're responsible for God as individuals. And He sent us an ethics whereby to live. According to Islamic law and Islamic ethics and Islamic theology, we are not responsible for the sin of our neighbors. We're not even responsible for the sin of our own wives and daughters and sons and fathers and mothers. On the day of judgment, we're only asked about our actions. There's so many verses in the Quran, eschatological verses, in which human beings are always said they're responsible for their own actions. We're not responsible for actions of others. However, the part is different and difficult. We live by virtue of certain support systems which society affords us. If we lived our whole life in a cave and there was a fig tree outside of the cave that fed us figs 12 months a year in the spring whereby to drink, and never met another human being, this, however, will not arise. But however, it does arise because we interact. And the question comes up, to what extent are we responsible for others. Famous saying of Christ, am I my brother's keeper? Here there are both positive and negative elements in Islamic ethics. We must help others as much as we can. So as much as Christian teaching, as Islamic teaching, as any religion, seriously. No religion can be without charity. But am I responsible for other people's wrongdoings? Over this issue, I do not want to fool you. Truthfully, there's been a great deal of disagreement among the ulama and scholars of Islam over the centuries. You all know the famous principle, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy anil munkar. That is to command what is good and to try to dissuade people from what is evil or what is forbidden. Some schools of Islamic law include this as part of the credo of faith. Some say no, this is mustahab, it's recommended, but it's not required. That is, am I as a Muslim required if somebody in the street is saying something wrong to stop and correct him? Or am I required if somebody is stealing from the shop as I'm passing by to stop and prevent him from doing so? Won't he shoot me? This is, of course, a question which is universal. You've seen people in New York being murdered or people walk by. You've seen in other states people putting their own lives at stake to save the neighbor. You just saw this last week, both of these occurred in the United States. And it's not Islamic law, it's a universal human predicament. But in the case of Islam, this is always a difficult question to answer. To what extent I as an individual am I responsible for the ethics of society? We know that in the Quran there are examples of Lut and the people of Lot and people of Thamud and other peoples who were punished collectively for their evil, not individually, except the few who were muttaqin, who were reverent towards God, were saved. We know there are several stories in the Quran, Surah Al-Nam, other surahs about this. Those of you who know the Quran know that well. The question is, to what degree was corruption, moral corruption, and evil prevalent in that society that everybody caught fire? There's a wonderful Persian saying that says, when fire comes, wet and dry wood burn together. There are a few Persian audience that understand what I said. Now, is this true? What happens to God's justice? These are very, very difficult questions. And if anyone tells you that will give you a definitive answer, it's usually an answer which satisfies certain things and doesn't satisfy other things. And I, for one, many people who ask me about this, always say we have to leave this to God's wisdom and God's mercy and God's justice. But He has held us responsible for trying to guide people who are doing evil towards what we believe to be the good. If they don't listen, it's their responsibility. So, as a result of this, again over the centuries, as a result of the application of Islamic law, and in Islam, ethics is related to divine law. In America or the West, ethics and law are not that closely related. Some say the law is the law, even it seems to be ethically bad. The law is the law. In Islam, if you ask what is the source of Islamic ethics, akhlaq, come from the Quran and Hadith, which are also the source of divine law, and they're interrelated. Definitely they're interrelated. Now, in society, as a result of the application of the Sharia, secondly, as a result of following the Sunnah of the Prophet, by people over the ages, who was actually the most important model for Islamic ethics, because the teaching of the Quran about ethics need a human model to follow. Quran talks about it, the Prophet lived it. And since we're alive as human beings, the living part helps us so much. So the Prophet is always the speaker in a living fashion for the verse of the Quran, of course, especially the question of ethics. So as a result of this application, there was built up in society a remarkable regard for social ethics, which was not completely individual. Let me give you an example. No Islamic society had lived without thieves. The only thieves are only in New York or Washington, or the situation is in Wisconsin. I know there are no thieves in Wisconsin, but anyway, they're all over the world. And in our part of the world, it's mostly petty thieves. Wall Street thieves are not found in the Islamic world, it's not yet. But there's a case in Iran which is getting close, but anyway. I think you know what I'm talking about, those of you who follow the news. Things which got so many zeros you can't read anymore. What's interesting is that this social ethics created in the Islamic world a sense of reliance upon members of society in a way which you do not find here. When the time for prayers comes in Mecca, the bazaar right next to the Haram is the bazaar for selling gold. The women oftentimes go to Mecca to buy jewelry. Everybody goes to the prayers. You could walk through that bazaar and walk in front of every store and pick up $1,000 and go put in your pocket and go to the next store. I've seen it a million times in my eyes. And even in the poor parts of Islamic society, something of that remains. Of course, the impact of colonialism, modernism, intrusion of other elements has weakened that. In big Islamic cities like Cairo, Tehran, Karachi, it's not like the old days. But even there, the tradition of social ethics is to be felt to a large extent. And again here, individual ethics is very much related to social ethics, except one dimension. One dimension which is not very much mentioned by usual speakers about Islam these days, but it's very, very central. The question comes up, why be ethical? So because God wants us to be ethical. But why does God want us to be ethical? Because He wants to perfect us. So ethics has to do with the possibility of perfection. And social ethics is support for human perfection. The goal of ethics is the inward cleansing and perfection. And that's where the spiritual disciplines of Islam, especially Sufism, come in. Is it accidental that every single important text of ethics in the Sunni world that is widely read was written by Sufis? Every single one. The Dala'il al-Qaireen, written in Egypt, Dala'il al-Khairat, excuse me, written in Madhab in Egypt, the books of Ghazali, all of these. Once in front of Al-Azhar University on purpose, they put books on the ground to sell in Cairo. I was walking with a friend, and I said, look, I have this theory. And he was one of these people who was half Salafi and so forth, didn't really accept the importance of Sufism. But he was a very ethical person. So look on the ground. And there were about 100 Arabic books on the ground. The poor fellow was selling, they didn't have a table. I'm sure they lived in the Cairo and all that. In front of a mosque, they put the books on the ground. And of course, there were a few Qur'ans and Hadith and Bukhari and so on the side. There were about 50 books of Islamic thought, and about 30 of them deal with ethics. Every single one was by a Sufi. No person in this room who could name a major treatise of Islamic ethics which is widely read, which was not either written by Sufi or inspired by Sufi. And the greatest ethical poems through which much of ethics was taught in the Islamic world. Persian to Persian, like me, Arab to someone Arab, Turkish to someone Turkish, all sometimes are very, very rich in ethical poetry. They were all Sufi poems. I mean, look at the influence of Malik Jalaluddin Rumi on the ethical behavior of Turks and Persians. This is shared by these two parts of the Islamic world. The Arabs didn't know Rumi very well until now. It's become popular thanks to American translation or something like that. that part of the Islamic world, or in India, some part of India. And I could give many other examples. And so in the field of ethics, again, the individual related society, a society provided an ethical support for the individual so that the individual could turn inward towards the inner life. Today, this is a very difficult thing to do. To try to follow the inner life in a society which does not have that support is a very heroic task. Of course, it's always a heroic task, but we always have external support. And so when we talk about ethics, you should think of the most famous book of ethics in the Arabic language, Ihya Ulumuddin, written by the great Ghazali, who was one of the greatest of Sufis. And you think of Shiism, the greatest book of ethics, Shiism, is the Mahajjatul Bayda fi Ihya, which is a Shiite form of the Ghazali's book by Faiz Kashani, who was also a famous Sufi and Gnostic writer from Kashani, where my family hails from, the center of Iran. Now let me turn, because my time is running out, in fact it's almost finished, a few minutes left, to the political life. This, of course, is the most contentious. First of all, let me ask the question, what type of government is Islamic that would bind the individual and society in the political world? To that answer, the answer to this question, in contrast to what Christian have a legal or even economic or social kind, there is no set answer to this question at the present moment in Islamic society. Islamic civilization went through 4 phases politically speaking. The short period of the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, the first 30 centuries. Then the period of the classical caliphate, of the Umayyads and Abbasids in the eastern lands of Islam, and the Western Umayyads in Iberia and North Africa. Those others that claimed to be caliphates, they were not really caliphates. Then the third phase was the first phase of the conversion of the caliphate to sultanate, to monarchy. Of course, already in a sense, Muawiyah was like a monarch, but not exactly so. There's a big difference. And that beginning was called sultana in Arabic. The word sultan was had dominion over, and sultan also means, of course, king. It's an English language, sultan. And it begins really from the Seljuk period, even within the caliphate, and it builds up. And the most extraordinary example of it is, of course, the Ottoman caliphate, called caliphate, the sultanate that dominates over the Eastern Mediterranean world and much of North Africa, and the Persian empire of the Safavids and the Mughal sultanate in India, which were the last 3 great empires of the Islamic world before they were broken up and they became smaller units. But gradually, in the 20th century, as you know, after colonialism, that period gradually began to change. We're still in the middle of that change from those traditional institutions of kingship and sultanate and so forth to, as you know, various forms of republic. And the Muslims are having a lot of trouble even understanding what a republic is. Of course, republic from the Greek res publica, meaning the public realm, but the meaning it has gained in Western political thought, of course, is what came out of the French Revolution, the decapitation of the French king, and the destruction of monarchy, and the establishment of a rule in which the power was transferred from God to the people. It's very, very significant. But when we first saw Islamic democracy was going in the air, in the classical theories, political theories of the West, you had the divine right of kings. Kings received the legitimacy from God. Now, this, through various revolutions in the Western world, which took a long, long time, gradually changed very, very gradually. Many people were killed, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Many revolutions took place. And that gradually, the power was taken out of the hands of God politically and put in the hands of the people. That is modern democracy, different from the democracy of the Magna Carta. British democracy, English democracy was first established. At that time, the English monarchs still had the divine right of kings. in modern time, the democracy of the people was only limited to certain things. But as secularism set into the West, gradually the laws of God over man were completely rejected, and they remain the rule of the people. So, some people brought up the old Latin adage, vox populi vox Dei, that the voice of the people is the voice of God. And try to defend this as being not against the will of God, but the will of God is expressed through the people. But we know that this is not really the case in that time, as it was in the classic case. Important to remember, when you try to think of Islam, is that this kind of secular democracy, a democracy in which the ultimate power, the legitimacy of political institutions, rests in the hand of the people, and the people are defined by historical accidents, whether a nation, a town, and what is it? What is the people? That itself is another story that is very long, and Islam is a lot of trouble coming to terms with modern nationalism, of course. But what's happening to Turkey, the Kurds in Turkey had no problem with the Ottoman period. Why did they have Kurdish uprisings in 1890? There's a modern nationalism that, of course, brought those problems about. There are many things like that. I don't want to get into those. But this transformation was only possible if society were first secularized. The Europeans had remained bound to Christianity as they were in the year 1400. The French Revolution would not have taken place. You must understand that. The Muslims must understand that. Now, the Islamic world is not secularized like in France of 1800. Most people still believe very much in religion. Believe that ultimate hukm, injunction of law, comes from God. And He's the ultimate ruler of the world. You know, the stickers that I have in America, Christ is King. That's good for a car sticker, but this king has no power as king in the United States, obviously. Whereas in the Muslim mind, God has not stopped ruling over the world. And that is why secular democracy has so much problem in the Islamic world. That's why the demands that the United States makes never come out. And that's why when we have real democracy in the Islamic world beginning, the West is against it. Because if you had real democracy, the voice of the people would be to allow the voice of God to rule over them. That's what's happening in Egypt now. Behind the scene machinations to prevent democracy from taking place. Just bring the name of Suleiman back and all that happened during the Mubarak regime. Who's supporting it? The army. Who's supporting the army? Who's paying the army? I don't have to say anything anymore. And this, you see that right before your eyes. Right before your eyes. And so in the Islamic world, not only is this difficult theological problem which the Islamic world has to solve, but it's also combined with remarkable hypocrisy. Bahrain is treated one way, Saudi Arabia is treated one way, Syria is treated another way. I mean, I don't want to get into politics of this kind, but you don't have to be very perceptive to know what's going on. What's going on in Syria right now is the same script that was used in Iran in 1978, when I lived in Tehran. Exactly the same script. Almost exactly the same book. They pulled it off the shelf and they're trying to apply it in a new situation. Now, in a situation like that, the question of Islamic democracy, I think, is a mute question. Of course, all Muslims would like to be free. But they would like to be free to be Muslims. The idea of being free from religion is rare in the Islamic world. The idea is to be free for religion. Many people in the West want to democracy, want to be free from any religious institutions. Whereas in the Islamic world, most of the Islamic are dominated by little minorities, which were put in there by the colonial powers. And people want to be free from them. They don't want to be free from Islam. And the big bugbear that's been created about the Sharia, that Gingrich and others come and say, oh, we'll never allow Sharia law to be promoted in the United States. As a Muslim, wanted to have Sharia law promoted in the United States. That's absurd. According to Islamic law, the Americans should follow the Christian Sharia. Like the Christians in the Ottoman Empire followed the Christian Sharia. In fact, it was called Sharia Nasr. The very word in Arabic was used as Christian Sharia. not Islamic Sharia. Nobody's going to ask English to call it Islamic Sharia. But the idea that this bugbear has been created is still one of the worst obstacles to understand what is really going on in Islam. I want to conclude by just one sentence. A dear teacher of mine, you know, I've criticized Orientalism a great deal, but I'm not like the word Seyyed. I try to call a spade a spade. Orientalists have made many mistakes and also made great contributions. I myself, as a humble scholar, belong to the great and noble British Orientalist, Sir Hamilton Gibb, who was also teacher at Dr. Ball here, who's sitting there, and I have this in common. Sir Hamilton once said something wonderful. Somebody asked him in class at Harvard, that was when he was a kindergarten at Harvard, before he started. Sir Hamilton, what is Islamic democracy? Can Islamic democracy work? He said, there's only one correct Islamic form of government, and that is Islamic democracy, the rule of divine law. What form the government takes is secondary. That's a very, very profound statement. That is, Islamic society, if left to itself, wants to have God's law promulgated so they'll die and go to heaven. They're still believers. What form the government takes, that God on purpose is left in the hands of Muslims. That's why in the Quran, there's only one verse, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, which is on every parliament wall in the Islamic world, consultant in affairs of state. Doesn't give any indication of structures, political structures, at all. Much less than economic, much less than inheritance of ethics, of eschatology, all the other things. Quran doesn't talk about this. The Sunnah and the history and so on and so on, which created institutions. And the Islamic world today is facing a daunting task of being disunited. Part of it is really sort of treason against the rest of the Islamic world, publics receiving money, tremendous amount of wealth, and pressure from the outside, which the West never had. When America carried out its revolution against the British, it was not a Chinese army in California pressing against the United States, and there were no Chinese submarines in the Gulf of Mexico. Whereas the Islamic world has to carry all of this with tremendous pressure from the West, which does not allow the inner dynamic of the Islamic world to manifest itself. But I, as a humble student of the Islamic world, and as a humble Muslim, I must admit to you, I hope inshallah I'm a Muslim, I believe that these deeper structures, which are sought to clarify for you a little bit tonight, are going to win the day. They're finally going to win the day. Although the Islamic world is weak, most of its governments are terrible, sold their people for a few $1 billion and a few nice houses in Kent. Nevertheless, Islam itself is a very powerful force in the Islamic world, and it's not becoming weaker. All the predictions made in the book Wither Islam, published in 1932, which Gibb published, in response to an earlier book by Zwemer that predicted that by the middle of the 20th century there would be no Islam left, you know all of those are totally false. And I hope that in conferences like this that are held, in an atmosphere in which debate can be carried out openly, this is God's grace. We thank God and the American people who have allowed this possibility. But these issues are brought out more fully and clearly. Because if people like yourselves do not bring this out in America, the number of mistakes that are being made in this country, step by step, through either ignorance or willed ignorance, through misinformation or disinformation, I do not know that, only God knows, so I don't want to get into that, will be tragic for everybody. Tragic for everybody. Whereas, if the Islamic world is allowed to have a normal, natural return to its own norms, I think we would not only be a benefit to the Islamic world, not only a benefit to the West, but to the whole of the world. And we certainly need that in this difficult age of human history. Thank you.
small gifts to our keynote speakers. So I would like to invite both the President of the Agro Foundation, Dr. Seyyed, and also Dr. Nasr and Dr. Wall, if you would mind, please come to the stage.
So this is for, we have a world-renowned calligrapher. He just came from Turkey. And he presented this. Thanks so much.
Yes, right here, Sultan Ahmad. I know the calligraphy, so something very similar. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
And it's for Professor John Hall. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Maybe for the
So one word, we should already thank and praise the Turkish people that after 17 years of pressure, they preserved the beautiful art of calligraphy, with Arabic calligraphy and even Latin calligraphy. So the best Nasr calligraphy in the world is done by them, not by Arabic programs.
Good evening to everyone. I'm not just here for another keynote, just for thanks to some of our friends here. It's really great to be here in Madison. My name is Seyyed. I'm the Executive Director of the Agro Foundation, and we are really honored to be a part of this conference. As a foundation, what we are trying to do is simple but noble. We are trying to build bridges between cultures, communities, and faiths. For this purpose, we organize programs, luncheon forums, morning conversations, lectures, conferences, panels, discussions, to bring people together, to live together, to work together for a better society. The idea behind proposing a conference on Islam and democracy is no different than our past activities and our vision, which includes our core values of promoting peace, understanding, and cooperation. I'd like to acknowledge all of the authors who contribute to this conference and all of the members of the editorial board. In particular, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to University of Wisconsin, Global Studies, Global International, and our keynote speakers, Professor Seyyed Nasr and Professor John Wall, and the real heroes of this conference, Mustafa Gökçek, Ahmet Kuru, Zeki Sartoprak, İhsan Yılmaz, Professor Kemal Karpat, and the organization committee, Professor Oğuzhan and Mehmet Ertem. I think they deserve a big round of applause. Thank you all for coming. Peace be with you and enjoy the dinner. Thank you.